thanks for listening to this week's episode of the Author Story Podcast, where we bring you the story behind the stories and behind the storytellers. My guest this week is Chris Pourteau, and our episode this week is brought to you by ragweed pollen. I apologize for my scratchy voice, but we're going to make the best of it. Welcome to the show, Chris.
Thanks, Hank. It's great to be here.
Yeah. So you have a recently newly released book that is set in the Pennsylvania universe.
Yes.
And you also have another book called Shadows Burned In, and
Yes.
we're going to dig into each of those. But to begin with, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself? How long have you been writing, and what inspires you to write?
Well, let's see. I'm 47, so I've been writing since I was probably 12 or so. And I guess the first thing I did, my life is pervaded by a love of Star Trek, by the way. So I guess the first thing I actually tried to write was started to write was a Star Trek novel when I was in, I don't know, junior high school, I guess, maybe early high school. And I remember using the old-fashioned typewriter, not your advanced technology IBM Selectric, mind you, but the actual, the kind you had the ribbon in and all that, and there were three colors, red, black, and white. And anyway, I remember using that machine to tap out part of a Star Trek novel when I was about 12 or 13 years old. So ever since then, it's kind of been a come and go thing. I did some short stories in college that attracted the attention of an agent. I actually had an agent when I was about 19 years old, and that sounds real impressive until you see the history of all that, which basically got me nothing. I actually had a couple of agents past that, which should tell you something right there. But traditional publishing and I have not had a productive relationship, let's say that. And so I would say after about my mid-20s, I just kind of pushed it all aside and went on with life. I actually wrote a novel while I was in college, and that's still sitting somewhere on the bottom of a big Tupperware container. Wrote another novel, what eventually became Shadows Burned In 1999, 2000 or so. And shopped that around a little bit, the traditional route. And of course, that didn't pan out either. And so I just kind of shelved it. And then when the opportunity for independent publishing came along, and there's a big story behind that, but I'll save that for later. But anyway, when that came along, I decided to dig it out of the cobwebs and put it out myself about a little over a year ago. That's what Shadows Burned In turned into. And as far as what motivates me to write, well, I'm a writer in my day job, a technical writer. I write articles mainly about transportation research. I work for an agency at Texas A&M that does that kind of work. And so I interpret often very technical material into articles and guidebooks and things like that normal people like you and me can understand. And so I write on a regular basis. And so I think, actually, I'm kind of glad that I didn't have success when I was younger. My younger self, should it time travel forward, would probably slap me for saying that, but honestly, I think I'm a much better writer now than I was then, and not just because of the fiction experience, but because of writing other kinds of media, like brochures and articles and guidebooks and media campaigns and all kinds of things that I've had to work on in my day job that have made me, in general, a better writer. So as far as what motivates me to write fiction, if I get a good idea and I want to pursue it, I write it. That's really taken off in the last 6 months to a year after Shadows. Not that Shadows has been a huge success by itself, but just plugging into the writer community, the independent author community, meeting friends that way, getting encouragement that way, encouraging others that way, has really sort of created a culture, almost like a culture, if you think of it in scientific terms, in a dish that has made me want to write more. So that's been a lot of fun in the last 6 months or so. So a very long-winded answer.
No, that's okay. I agree with you that being plugged into a good community uh, makes all the difference in the world with regard to staying motivated, also feeding off of each other's excitement and
Hmm.
ambition. Do you want to talk a little bit about that and kind of what your
Sure.
journey into self-publishing has been like? I'd like for you to talk about maybe what your expectations were. Um, I know you talked about the traditional publishing route, and we can kind of weave our conversation around that. But when
Sure.
you started self-publishing, you obviously came into it with certain expectations. And
Right.
what was the reality versus those expectations?
Well, to start with the expectations, and that loops us a little bit back around to
Yeah.
my traditional publishing experience. I had such a negative experience with that. Negative meaning no success, not a lot of. I didn't feel like I was particularly supported by the agents that I dealt with, and I realized that I'm just one more widget in their assembly line, and that's kind of how it felt. But at the same time, they were essentially working for me, and never felt that way. So I think I came into independent publishing with two assumptions in mind. One of them was that I was going to. Well, I shouldn't say I was going to have a negative experience. I was expecting a negative experience based on my traditional publishing experience, and two, I was really had an idea in my head that that independent publishing was essentially the electronic version of vanity press,
Right.
which I think a lot of people have. Vanity press meaning you pay somebody to publish your book, and of course the stigma being because you're not good enough for anybody to publish it without you paying them. And I kind of looked at independent publishing that way. Okay, well, I'm putting my own book out. What's the difference between that and vanity press? Um, But what disabused me of that notion was reading writers like Roberto Calas, Nick Cole. Um, I read lots of independent independent works. Ed Robertson's another one, where the story just looked like it was going to interest me, and I read it and I was like, oh, this doesn't suck. These guys are actually really good writers. And Nick, since then, Nick has gotten a traditional publishing relationship going, and Roberto is with 47 North, and so they have moved on to that, but they didn't start that way. And when I read their stuff, and I was like, these guys are really good. I thought, maybe it's not the same thing as Vanity Press. Maybe it's a different kind of venue, a different kind of opportunity. And so that's kind of what led me into it. And the other thing I said was, I can sit here and feel sorry for myself and talk about lazy agents and publishers with no taste for the rest of my life, or I can shape this thing up from 12, 13 years ago, put it out there, and the market will decide. And that's fine. I'd rather get the bad news now and go
Yeah,
on building ships in a bottle or something for the rest of my life
that's right.
than crank out stuff that nobody wants to read. So that's how I kind of came to independent publishing. I had some preconceived ideas that I quickly disabused myself of because the guys that I was reading were really good. And so I thought, well, if I'm lucky, maybe I'll be one of them.
When you had your agent, what sort of support did you get from them? And did they help you in editing and shaping your manuscript, or did
A
they
little
just
bit.
kind of act like salesmen that worked on your behalf?
A little bit. I mean, keep in mind this was 25 years ago.
Gotcha.
And I did the writers market thing, and I'm even old enough that I was in the transition period when the writers market actually took their editing and agent piece and started putting it out as a separate book. I remember that process. And so what I experienced was um, it was supportive, but it was almost like, yeah, like you said, kind of like a salesman support. Like they always had a bright smile on the other end of the phone for me. but I never saw a whole lot of action. Now, that doesn't mean that they didn't put my stuff forward to publishers and the publishers just said they weren't interested, because I have the rejection letters to prove that. But I never felt the personal connection that I've felt with the authors that I work with now. And just to tell you an anecdote about how all that came about, I was basically doing everything on my own up until about June. I guess earlier in the year I had met through Nick. First of all, let me back up another step.
Yeah.
I started corresponding with Roberto Calas and Nick Cole, and a little bit with Ed Robertson. I read their stuff and I was like, I'm just going to send these guys a note and say, I really appreciate, you guys have helped me figure out that independent publishing is not vanity press. And and they responded, and they were cordial and they were friendly. And I was like, holy crap, Hemingway just wrote me back. That never happens. What is that? See, I still have this traditional publishing thing in my head, right? This distant author up here, reader down here assumption. And so that alone, just figuring out that they were nice guys like me, just regular guys, and that they took the time to write me. And I realize that is part of the marketing model now, but I don't, especially in Nick's case, when I was sort of in the doldrums about Shadows not doing any sales. He has taken the opportunity on several occasions to really give me some emotional and writerly support, and that all by itself really helped me get over my concerns about what independent publishing was really all about. And so back around June or so, this is after I started talking to Michael Bunker, whom I met through Nick Cole, by the way. Turns out we live about 6 hours apart here in Texas.
Awesome.
Yeah, exactly. It's a small world. But so I kind of formed a friendship with Michael, and Michael was at that time about to put out, Michael and others, about a dozen other authors, including Ed and Nick, were about to put out Synchronic, the time travel anthology. And I said, hey man, I'll ARC read it for you. And he sent me a copy, and I ARC read it and reviewed it. And I participated for the first time, and this is the old man talking. In my day, we didn't have these kinds of chat room things. We didn't have all this fooferall on the interwebs. But anyway,
Series of tubes.
It's a series of tubes, and you put messages in them, and you blow hard, and they come out the other end. It's amazing. But anyway, so there was this launch party for Synchronic, and I was actually in El Paso for the day job, and I got there, I think it was a Thursday night. See, this is the kind of impression it made on me. It was a Thursday evening, and I hopped in the chat rooms, and they were launching the anthology, and Christie was in there, and Michael was in there, and Nick was in there, and Jennifer Ellis was in there, Sam Peralta was in there, all these people that I've gotten to know since then. And they were all having fun and cracking jokes, and the readers were interacting, and I thought, this is cool. This is really cool. It's about as far away from the writer up here, reader down here thing as you could possibly get. And I had a blast for like 3 hours interacting with these folks. And keep in mind, I just read and reviewed their short stories for Synchronic, and was really impressed with everything that I had read. And so I still had a little bit of the starriness in my eyes, being a new author myself, hardly interacted with anybody really other than the handful of people I've mentioned. And so getting in the chat room with these folks and joking around and having a good time really made a positive impression on me. And since then, I'm working with some of those folks on an anthology of short stories set in Michael's Pennsylvania world. We arc read each other's stuff. We give feedback to each other. It really is this recursively supporting authorial community, and we have a blast. At least speaking for myself, I have a blast. Corresponding with them and saying, "What do you think of this?" and them saying, "What do you think of that?" And it really is this group of kids sitting around a table trading ideas in a way, and it's about as far away from the traditional hierarchical publishing process as you could possibly get.
I can personally vouch for that spirit of camaraderie. Also, just the amount of humble support that is available and freely given by this community is just amazing.
Yes, absolutely.
Uh, let's go over to Shadows Burned In really quickly. How has that book changed uh, since the original version that you wrote some years ago to the version that it is now, or has it changed at all? And you also mentioned earlier that you were happy that you did not find success earlier in life, and I also feel the same way about that. If I were to have found success in my 20s, I don't think that I could have written the kind of honest stories that I'm able to write now, just simply because of the life experience, and um, not to take anything away from young writers.
Sure.
I have a 19-year-old son who's a fantastic writer. He's a naturally gifted writer, and I am one of those people that has to work at it. But it's something that I appreciate.
Right?
Yeah, I appreciate my life experience at this point, and in that sort of context, how does Shadows Burned In? How has that changed and morphed and come into its own?
Well, I mean, you're absolutely right. There is no substitution for life experience. I mean, because ultimately, you've got people reading these books. My opinion is plot is derivative. Everything is derivative of character, because the plot isn't reading the book. Action isn't reading the book.
Right.
People are reading the book, so people are important. The most important thing. But to answer your question on a practical level, when I came out of college, I have a graduate degree in English. I came out of college with a very academic writing style. Academic equates to 10-cent words, lots of prepositional phrases, and long, complex sentences conjoined by coordinating conjunctions. And subtitles, always subtitles following a colon. But anyway, my writing style was much more complex and long-winded than it is now. I mean, I still fall into that because that was still that's still the rut that I trained into. But one of the ways that SBI changed is that when I went back and rewrote it, 18 months ago, interject now all the experience that I had in my day job, where I take long-winded engineering, highly technical content and boil it down. I take the and the but out. I take the three prepositional phrases in a row out, and I make the sentences shorter and more dynamic and with active rather than passive voice, because that's the way you direct people on how to do something. And so I learned how to do that, plus marketing copy. Okay, I have 100 words to work with on the cover of this, or on the inside panel of this brochure. I have to be very pithy, and I have to be very active, and I have to be very my images have to work for whatever it is we're trying to sell or whatever point we're trying to make. And so I learned all of that in the day job in technical writing. And so I took that experience and applied it back and I mean, like every other writer, and I'm sure you've experienced this, you go back and you read something you wrote 5 or 10 years ago, and you just kind of put your head in your hands and you're like, how the hell did I even get that on the paper? Right. My God, really? Come on, man. And so that was a lot of the practical side of how it changed. I guess, in fact, I rewrote it several times after I put it up on Amazon. I had one friend of mine tell me that I needed to. There's a chapter in it where the character Elizabeth goes into a virtual reality chamber, sort of to escape her bickering parents, and it basically becomes a fantasy D&D kind of experience for her, and it's totally immersive, and it's like she's actually there and in combat and stuff. And all my chapters are about, if I recall right, about 3,500 words, and so was that one. And this friend of mine, this writer friend of mine, said, that really goes on for a long time because it's a totally different writing style. It's a totally different, and by design it is,
Yeah.
but it went on for a long time. And I kind of looked at it and I was like, you know what? I'm going to cut that in half. And so initially it was out there at its regular length, and about, I don't know, 6 or 8 months ago, I went through it and I cut it down by, probably 1,500 words. And I think it works much better now. So that's the nice thing about publishing electronically. It can also be frustrating for the reader, I guess. But you can fix it. You can always go back and change it. It's
Right.
not sitting on a library shelf somewhere for all time, not as good as it could be. So that's kind of the practical side to your answer, I think. Well, did I miss something? Did you have another question there?
No, I was just, well, I guess aside from the practical aspect of it, what emotionally or content-wise, how did the book grow from the time you originally wrote it until now?
I'd say about 85 to 90% of what's in there was in there when I finished it. What really changed was the language and the way the writing style became pithier and more direct. But I did like one thing in there, and I don't want to give too much away in case somebody hasn't read it, but there's a character that dies in a particularly gruesome way in the third part. And that whole scene was expanded and rewritten multiple times in the last year or so. And I really tried to use Edgar Allan Poe as my guide or template there, in this sense that as this character dies, each of the senses is peeled away, that to me is reminiscent of something Poe might do. So I would expand or contract, in the case of the fantasy chapter, things to just sort of tighten it up and make it a more impactful book. One of the things I learned after reading Synchronic, or relearned, I should say, because it had been a long time. We have this culture where we walk in the half-price books or something and grab the next 3 books off the shelf in the series and start plowing into them. And I had forgotten the joy of reading a short story.
Yes.
Because it's so compact. It's there. You have one experience. It's like reading a fine short poem. You have an emotional reaction to it if the writer's done a good job. And it's a nice, focused, finite experience, which, when most of us are used to spending 15 seconds on the internet clicking order with one click on Amazon, we're used to that kind of thing, right? And so the short story kind of folds into that need for focused time management. And so I really learned how to love the short story again through Synchronic. And so one of the things that I did, and as I was rewriting SBI again, was, okay, I need to focus the effect here. I don't need a lot of exposition. I'm not a very good exposition writer. I think if I do anything well, it's dialogue. Exposition bores me as a reader, so I try not to do a lot of it as a writer.
And exposition can, in a lot of cases, turn into a lot of navel gazing.
Exactly.
If you're not careful. It can be done well, of course, but the tendency is to just get a little too inwardly focused, I guess.
Yes, exactly, which folds into the discussion we were having just a second ago about time management.
Yeah.
I don't have time to read 10 pages about how the leaves are changing color on trees. It's lovely, but I don't have time for that.
Right.
And so tell me what this character's impressions are, how the changing colors in the leaves reflect his or her emotional state and what's going on inside the character. That's fine, but don't just give me a lesson in leaf colors, because I don't really care.
Right. Speaking of short stories, there seems to be a short story renaissance of sorts. Back in the 50s, 60s, into the 70s, there were all these literary journals and sci-fi and fantasy journals and things like that, where you could
Hmm.
get a collection of short stories.
Hmm.
But a lot of those things have kind of gone by the wayside. And it seems to me that self-publishing and Amazon and KDP especially have really kind of cranked up this short story renaissance,
Hmm.
and they're much more prevalent, and there's lots of exciting things that are going on in that space uh, there now, and Synchronic is a great example of that.
Hmm. I think there are a lot of things. There are several things going on there. I think, first of all, people like short stories or are learning to re-like them
Yeah.
again, as I did, because they're short. I can read them as I'm falling asleep and probably get through one. And that's one aspect of it. Another aspect of it is part of the marketing model for independent publishing now is you drop a lot of stories out there and people will buy your first one and then like it and go back and buy your other nine. Well, it's a lot easier to write 10 short stories than it is 10 novels.
Right.
I think that's part of it. Also, in terms of collections, as we all, since the marketing model has basically shifted, the onus of marketing and design, I mean, everything used to be the writer wrote the book, sold it, the publisher edited it, slapped a cover on it, published it, stuck it in the bookstores, marketed it, whatever they were going to do to it. The author was already on to their next book. Well, the onus of all that external stuff is now on the independent authors. And so, one easy way, relatively easy way for us to market ourselves to potentially new readers is to be in an anthology. If I'm in an anthology with Nick Cole and Michael Bunker, Jennifer Ellis and Kevin Summers and everybody else, um, their readers are going to buy that anthology to read their story because they're fans of that writer. But they might happen to kick on to the next story, which might be mine, and they say, oh, well, he's not bad either, and then go over to my catalog and start looking at my stuff. And if you think about it, if you've got 10, 12 people in an anthology, that's 10 or 12 times the opportunity for you and each of them to connect with the different readership. And so it's a marketing opportunity for the writers as well. I think there are lots of things coming together to make the short story a much more attractive medium than maybe, say, 10 years ago.
So, how did you get started in? You told me about getting plugged in with Nick Cole and Michael Bunker and
Hmm.
that group of folks. You've recently released a book in Michael Bunker's universe. Do you want to talk about that?
Sure. Well, I read Pennsylvania, and like, pretty much everybody else on the planet, thought it was great.
Right.
And I thought about, uh, well, I had talked to him about doing this short story collection called Tales from Pennsylvania, and he was enthusiastic. And so we got people on board to do that, and that's going to be coming out next month, hopefully before Thanksgiving. That's the plan. But as I was writing that short story, I kind of got even because you have to invest yourself in the world, and you have to kind of not just read it and appreciate it, but actually kind of get inside it and live it. And I really enjoyed that experience for the short story that I wrote that's going to be in the collection. And one of the characters in the story, I don't want to give a lot away because the story has a bit of a twist to it. But one of the characters in the story demanded a little bit more stage time. And so I thought, well, how can I give this character some more life? Obviously I have to do it within the universe of Pennsylvania. And I thought, Pennsylvania, well, I'm a big Civil War buff and a huge fan of the movie Gettysburg and the book Killer Angels that it's based on by Michael Shera. And I thought, well, so New Pennsylvania, what if they came to this new world and called it New Pennsylvania? And of course, the people bring all of their baggage with them. Some of that baggage is just names of places and, all that kind of thing. So what if there's this town called Gettysburg in New Pennsylvania? And if you know the historical battle, basically the battle occurred when the Confederates went to Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, looking for some shoes because they were wearing holes in the bottom of their shoes and there was a shoe factory there and or storage there. And so they bumped up against some Union cavalry, and the next thing you know, you have the biggest biggest battle of the Civil War, and up until that point, the South had basically been kicking the North's ass.
Right.
And I think that kind of played a part in Lee's hubris in pursuing the battle the way he did. But in any case, it became the turning point of the Civil War. It's called the high water mark of the Confederacy, meaning that after that, everything was downhill for the Confederacy. And so it's, in other words, all this, I'm rambling a bit, but the historic battle was very important historically to the country, in the Civil War and to the whole country. And I thought, well, what if I interpreted the battle itself, 3 days, the rebels show up looking for something, and they bump up against a force they didn't anticipate, and then it becomes this big, bloody conflict. And that's how that story was born. So Trace shows up looking for exilium, which is this energy sourcing mineral in Pennsylvania. The book. They look for it because it's going to power some weapons that they need. They're still fighting with projectile weapons against a much more capable transport authority who is using laser weapons. And so they show up looking for this mineral so that they can produce some laser weapons themselves and help balance the scales a little bit against transport. And so that was the initial idea for the story.
What's it like working in someone else's universe as opposed to something that you have created from scratch?
Well, in a way, it's easier. You don't have to come up with all of the mythos that surrounds that universe. Somebody else has done that for you. I wouldn't say that. I was going to say the downside. It's not a downside. You have to be careful, though. The thing that I was concerned about was making sure Michael was happy with the story. This is his creation, the world, and I don't want to go muck it up. Yeah. And besides that, I admire what he's done in that story, in that universe, and so I want him to be happy with it. But even if he doesn't want to endorse it necessarily, which he was gracious in doing with Gettysburg, but even if he didn't want to do that, I didn't want him thinking I'd screwed something up. I wanted to make sure that he was happy with at least my effort in making sure I did justice to what he had created. So on the one hand, it's easier. On the other hand, you have a responsibility, at least in my opinion, to do right by the author, his readers, and the world that he created, which sort of has a life of its own.
Now, is Pennsylvania an official Kindle world?
No, not yet.
Okay.
Maybe that will be the case in the future, but no, to my knowledge, it's not.
So what was the process like? And for those that don't know, Kindle Worlds is where an author who has a rich universe that they've created opens up their world for other people to write those stories, and they are kind of all become connected in an officially endorsed way.
Right.
But since that was not the case, what was the process like working with Michael, and what was the process that you went through? In other words, if someone else wanted to do that with fan fiction is a big thing. If someone wanted to respectfully work in someone else's universe, how would they go about doing that?
Well, I can only speak to my experience with Michael. Again, we had become friends. I mean, we pretty much chat every day, if not every day, every 2 or 3 days. And we had already been working together on the Tales from Pennsylvania, which is the anthology that'll be out next month. Can you tell I'm advertising? Next month, coming, Tales from Pennsylvania. But anyway, so I just said, I kind of have this idea. What do you think? And there were already people, besides the folks working in the anthology, there were already people writing independent fan fiction. And he said, yeah, great, go for it. And I think my advice would be talk to the creator of the world first, and even if there's no formal contract, which there wasn't for Gettysburg, anything where he says, yes, you may use my world, I acknowledged it on the both on the copyright page and on the title page of Gettysburg. The title page being more of a nod and a respectful nod to the fact that he created the universe, and the copyright page saying, "Hey, I'm doing this with permission." The legalese. So I would contact the person if possible, if they're contactable, if they're approachable, and say, "I'd really like to do this." There's really no downside for anybody involved. Well, as long as the fan fiction that's created has a measure of quality to it, and that measure is shifting, but it depends on who's looking. I the beholder and all that, but there's really no downside. If I write a story, if I write Gettysburg, and it becomes popular at all, and people like, okay, I like this story. Oh, it came from here. Let me go check out this guy's book called Pennsylvania.
Exactly.
It helps him.
Right.
If he refers people to Gettysburg, it helps me. It expands the universe for everybody. Readers are voracious for content, and he can't write. Even Michael Bunker, a.k.a. the Grinder, cannot write fast enough to satisfy people that like his universe. Yeah. And so I'm helping him out in that way, and then I'm giving them a morsel before their next meal. So it really, there is no downside. The only potential downside is if the fan fiction is particularly, let's say somebody writes a book of Amish porn or something, that he would hate, and probably his readership would hate. It could cast a pall, even if it's unwarranted. It could cast a pall on his stuff. But I mean, that's such an extremist example. There really is no downside.
Well, speaking of Michael Bunker, I spoke with him, and I told him that I was interviewing you, and I said, "Is there anything that you would like for me to convey?"
Did he try to dissuade you from that?
Well, he said yes, and I will quote, "Tell him that Bunker had his doubts working with a French Aggie, but he was pleasantly surprised." End quote.
Well, that's okay. I appreciate that. A French Aggie, I would have doubts working with a French Aggie myself, honestly. But that's coming from him. That's high words of praise, so I'll take it.
Yeah. So, Chris, you have Shadows Burned In. How would you describe SBI in genre terms? What would you tell someone that book is about?
That's tough. It's got literary ambitions because I came out of graduate school in the English program, so everybody that does thinks they're going to write the next greatest American novel. Right. And today there are so many genres are easy ways for marketing people to classify fiction. Yeah. They are not necessarily indicative of the content. Yes, exactly. Again, I'm being long-winded with you, but I would say it's very cross-genre. Okay, here's the fence-sitting answer. It's very cross-genre. If I had to classify it, I would call it sort of light horror. Yeah. Because there's a sort of this, and I'll just use general terms, sort of this haunted house. There's this prison escape. There's this, really nasty prisoner that gets out. There's family drama stuff going on between a husband and wife, and their daughter is sort of dealing with that fallout, and it's very there's that fantasy sequence that could have come right out of a fantasy novel, lifted whole. There's suspense, there's thriller, there's a Texas fiction aspect to it. In the sense that there are certain things like, I had to edit this out several times, but this just tells you how a writer puts themselves into what they're doing, right? But I must have had half a dozen references to the refreshing cool breeze at the 1st of October or something like that. Well, if you live where I live in Texas, that's like a celebratory thing. Yeah. And I had to go in and edit some of that out because I'm like, dude, you said this 4 times already. Yeah. Not everybody lives in this town. So. Yeah.
Well, and I can completely feel what you're saying there because I have to be careful about writing stories based in the Mississippi Delta and that not everyone understands what 100% humidity feels like in the middle of summer.
Yeah, yeah, that's right. It's not air, it's water.
Right,
There's water
yeah,
suspended in front of you.
that's right. And the joke is that if you live here long enough, you'll grow gills. And
Yeah,
that's
yeah.
and that's great to mention a time or two, but not everyone gets it the way we do. So
Right,
yeah,
right, and part of the reason for mentioning that kind of thing is to set atmosphere,
exactly.
or the cool breeze refreshed her face or whatever, and so that tells you something about where the character is. It's not just describing the wind blowing. But yeah, and that's one of the things I struggle with in my writing is it's a very recursive process for me. Like when I wrote Gettysburg, I was doing it. I do it part time because I have a full time job.
Sure.
And a full-time 12-year-old that I'm now responsible for. I got married about 8 months ago. And so I was doing it from like 6:30 to 7:30 in the morning before I would go to work. So I would bang out, 450 words at a pop. So Monday I bang out my 450 words, and then Tuesday morning I get up to write, and I'll read back through that and then type the next 450 words. And then Wednesday I'll read back through what I did Tuesday and then go on to the next. So it's a very recursive kind of process for me. I'm also a technical editor, and so I can't just leave a word on a page that I'm not happy with. That doesn't mean it comes out perfect the second time either, but it's not. I don't just write a story or a book and then go back at the beginning and start over. It's a continually kind of recursive process for me. So that's what I did on Gettysburg. That's what I did on Susquehanna, which is the sequel to that, which is coming out in a couple of weeks. And so I don't know. Did I lose the thread of your question?
No, that's. I was actually using that to kind of segue into talking about more of your writing process, and you did that perfectly. Are you an everyday writer?
I'm a most days writer. It just depends. Part of the reason I was getting up so early is because I've had some lower back problems. Not to go into that, but it would get me out of bed early anyway, and so I would use that time. And that's gotten a little bit better lately, so I'm getting lazy and sleeping in. But now instead I'm writing a little bit in the evenings, and I really try to bang out about 2,000 or 3,000 words on the weekend, which for some is nothing. That's like 5 hours of effort on a Friday afternoon, but for me that's a lot compared to 400 or 500 words that I can write at a time. So
well, but those someone who writes consistently 400 or 500 words on most days will run circles around a weekend 2,000 word writer who sporadically shows up.
Right, you can call me the tortoise.
Yeah.
Right.
Are you an outliner or are you a pantser?
I'd love to be a pantser, but I'm not. I'm part of my editing trade is to be very meticulous and attentive to detail and all that. And I am much better being prepared than I am flying by the seat of my pants.
Yeah.
So in fact, before we started talking, I was working on a project outline, and I'm a person who needs information to feel in control. Even if I'm not really in control, it makes me feel that way.
Right.
So if I can outline a story and know where I'm going and feel like I have direction, then I can relax into the story and write it. If I'm making it up as I go along, I'm like, my eyes are going left and right, and I'm like, but he wouldn't say that, would he? Wait a minute, maybe he would. I don't know, would he? Because I don't have any direction. I'm creating it as I go along, and that's not my comfort zone.
Gotcha. I tend to be more of a hybrid writer. I would love to fly by the seat of my pants and just be artsy about it and do like Stephen King and we just put characters in a situation and see what they do and that's great, but I'll never finish anything if I do that because we'll be traipsing off through the woods, just me and the characters doing whatever.
Looking at the leaf colors,
yeah.
But
I have found that that structuring out the plot so I know where the story is going, and I, kind of hit all the beats and know what needs to happen and things like that. But then kind of discovery writing the characters is a great hybrid for me, and allowing some of those interpersonal interactions and things like that kind of happen
Right.
organically.
Right.
And I kind of get the feeling that when we're talking about Shadows Burned In, and that how it's really a literary novel in that it deals with real character emotion and things like that. I'm kind of getting that feeling from you. Is that
Yeah, I think that's accurate. I mean, your use of the word hybrid is good. It's not that I plot out what everybody's going to say and then I go write it, because then it would be written already.
right?
But like with Gettysburg, for example, I knew I wanted it to be 3 days because the historic battle was 3 days. I knew they were going after Exilium because there were shoes in the historic battle, and I knew they were going to lose because the Confederates lost the battle. Um, so that's kind of what I had, and I knew also that the first day was going to be just sort of a skirmish, and the second day was going to be the big bloody day, and the third day, unlike the historic battle, which Pickett's charge and all of that was really a horrible day. The third day was more like a hit, a retreat, and then that allowed me to develop the story where they end up in the Amish zone and some other aspects of the story. But that's kind of what I had in mind. And then when I was writing, I was like, okay, let's do the start in the middle of the action thing. And so I started the battle with them under fire, and to get the reader, get the adrenaline pumping right off the bat. And that's pretty much all I had in my head. The rest of it just occurred as I was writing, and especially the back and forth between the characters and their banter. That's all organic to the story. That just came out.
You being a Star Trek fan and a lifelong sci-fi fan, do you find that the stories like Gettysburg come easier than the horror and those other type stories? Do you feel like there's more that you understand the language more, so to speak?
I'm probably I like horror too. I mean, as you point out, I was one of the I was about 6 or 7 in the 70s when the Star Trek resurgence happened, and so I'm proud to say I'm a card-carrying member of that generation. The horror stuff, I read Stephen King in high school and college and beyond, and so I was a huge John Saul and Dean Koontz and some of those other writers from the mid to late 80s that were popular at the time. So I'm just as comfortable in the horror genre. I'm probably, if you asked me to write a mystery, I'd probably be less comfortable. A romance, I would be extremely uncomfortable. But sci-fi, from the way you asked the question, maybe because I'm used to the idea of ships flying around and lasers blasting, and I'm much more willing to suspend my disbelief earlier in the process with that. Maybe so, rather than ghost stories. But one or the other, it doesn't really make any difference to me.
What's coming up next for you, Chris?
Susquehanna, which is the sequel to Gettysburg, will be out towards the end of this month. I'm hoping to run a sort of a promotion on SBI towards the end of this month, because the concept of Halloween and that time period, the cool October air and all that, is integral in that novel for atmosphere. So I'm hoping to sell a few copies of that. Tales from Pennsylvania will come out in late November, hopefully before Thanksgiving, and I'll have a short story in there which relates back to one of the characters in Gettysburg and Susquehanna. And then eventually I'll put out a third story in the Gettysburg line that once that's out, then I'll put together an omnibus, hopefully by the end of the year for all of that, but it might be more like late January, early February. After that, the skies are clear.
Awesome. Well, Chris, thank you for taking time out of your Saturday to spend doing this interview. Do you have a website where people can connect with you?
I don't. See, I'm still that young in this whole independent publishing thing. I don't have a blog. I don't have a website. But those are coming, hopefully by the end of the year. You can find me. I do have an author's page on Amazon, and I have an author's page on Goodreads. And so you can find me that way. If you want,
your email address is on your Amazon author page.
Yes, you can email me at c.Pourteau.author@gmail.com. And if you need to know how to spell the last name, just check it out at Amazon. Look up Shadows Burned In at Amazon. You can find me.
And I'll link all those in the show notes for sure.
Sweet.
Yeah. Chris, thank you. It's been a pleasure. I currently am about 3/4 of the way through Shadows Burned In, and I'm looking forward to finishing up that this weekend. It's a fantastic book. I thoroughly enjoyed it, and your Pennsylvania story is next on my reading list. Thank you, sir, and we wish you continued success.
Thanks for the opportunity to talk to you and your listeners, and I'm glad you're enjoying SBI, and I look forward to hearing what you think of it when you're done.
Thanks for listening, and as always, find all episodes at hankgarner.com. Follow us on Twitter at Hank the Writer and on Facebook at author Hank Garner.